The conquest was supposed to go the other way. The horsemen arrived from the north. They burned cities, shattered armies, crossed walls that generations of emperors had built, and eventually rode into Beijing as victors. By every rule of history, China should have become Mongol. It didn't. A few centuries later, another northern people did it again. The Manchus crossed the Great Wall, seized Beijing in 1644, crushed resistance across the empire, and established one of the most powerful dynasties in Chinese history. China still didn't become Manchu. This is one of the strangest patterns in world history. Not because China was never conquered, it absolutely was. The common narrative often treats Chinese civilization as an uninterrupted story of native dynasties rising and falling. Reality is messier. Foreign armies conquered northern China repeatedly. Some conquered all of it. Several sat on the dragon throne itself. Yet something happened after the victory. The conquerors won the war and then slowly found themselves speaking Chinese, governing through Chinese institutions, studying Chinese classics, and defending a political order they originally arrived to overthrow. Military power changed hands. Civilizational power often didn't. And that's the puzzle. Because we're talking about one of the largest concentrations of people on Earth, during many periods of history, China contained a quarter of humanity. Controlling that population was one challenge. Convincing it to function under an entirely foreign system was another. Those turned out to be very different things. The Mongols learned this first on a truly imperial scale. When Kublai Khan established the Yuan Dynasty in 1271, he wasn't just inheriting territory. He was inheriting a governing machine that had evolved over centuries. Tax collection, canal management, grain distribution, provincial administration, records, law, examinations, the boring parts of empire. History has a habit of celebrating battles and forgetting paperwork. Yet paperwork is usually what decides whether a conquest survives beyond a generation. An empire can be captured on horseback. It cannot be managed entirely from horseback. Kublai understood this faster than many of his relatives elsewhere in the Mongol world. While other Mongol khanates remained more closely tied to steppe traditions, the Yuan court increasingly relied on Chinese administrators, Chinese methods, and Chinese concepts of statecraft. Not because the Mongols suddenly fell in love with Confucian philosophy, because governing 80 million people without it was becoming difficult. There's a subtle distinction there that matters. Many people imagine cultural assimilation as a voluntary process. A conqueror admires the civilization he conquered and adopts parts of it. That certainly happened. But admiration alone doesn't explain the pattern. Necessity does. Imagine inheriting the largest corporation on Earth while refusing to use any of its accounting systems, management structures, training methods, or institutional knowledge. You could try, for a while. Then reality would start sending invoices. This is where the story becomes more interesting than simple China absorbed its conquerors. Because the process wasn't immediate, it wasn't automatic, and it certainly wasn't inevitable. The Mongols actively tried to preserve their separate identity. They maintained ethnic hierarchies. They reserved important privileges for themselves. They understood the danger of disappearing into a much larger population. The fact that they worried about it tells us something important. They saw the gravitational pull, too. Remember that phrase, gravitational pull. We'll come back to it. Because the Mongols were only the first major demonstration of a pattern that would repeat itself with almost mathematical consistency. A pattern so powerful that even conquerors who studied the Mongol experience and tried to avoid the same fate eventually found themselves moving down a remarkably similar path. And the most successful example wasn't Kublai Khan. It was a dynasty that entered Beijing nearly 400 years later, believing it had learned every lesson from the Mongols' mistakes. The Manchus arrived in Beijing with a plan. That alone made them different. When the Ming Dynasty collapsed in 644, the people who would found the Qing Dynasty weren't charging blindly into an unknown civilization. They had spent decades studying China from the outside. They watched previous dynasties rise and fall. They understood the fate of the Mongols. Most importantly, they were determined not to repeat it. The irony is that this preparation made them more Chinese, not less. Before entering Beijing, the Manchu leadership under Hong Taiji had already begun adopting Chinese administrative practices. Chinese officials served in their government. Chinese legal concepts entered their institutions. Chinese scholars advised their court. Not because they had surrendered culturally, because they were preparing to rule. That's the distinction that keeps showing up. Conquest gets you through the gates. Administration keeps you there. And China was a place where administration mattered more than almost anywhere else on earth. Think about the scale for a moment. The Qing inherited a territory stretching from Manchuria to the subtropical south. Different climates, different economies, different languages. Tens of millions of farmers depending on irrigation systems, flood controls, tax records, and grain logistics that had been refined over centuries. A cavalry charge cannot manage a river basin. An army cannot organize harvests. A victorious general cannot personally supervise every county magistrate across an empire larger than Europe. Eventually, every conqueror reaches the same crossroads. Either preserve your traditional system and lose control, or adopt the existing machinery and keep the empire functioning. The Qing chose the machinery, and it worked astonishingly well. In fact, this is where the story takes a turn most people don't expect. The Qing dynasty became arguably more successful at governing China than many native Chinese dynasties. That's not a comfortable fact for nationalist narratives, but history isn't obligated to make anyone comfortable. Under emperors like Kangxi Emperor, Yongzheng Emperor, and Qianlong Emperor, the empire expanded dramatically. Population exploded. Internal stability improved. Administrative systems became more sophisticated. The Qing didn't simply inherit the Chinese state, they mastered it. Yet there was a catch. The very process that made them successful also deepened their dependence on Chinese institutions. Every year, more officials were trained through Confucian frameworks. Every year, more government business was conducted through Chinese administrative traditions. Every year, the dynasty became less capable of imagining rule outside that system. This wasn't cultural defeat. It was institutional capture. A phrase I think explains far more of history than people realize. We often imagine powerful civilizations spreading through force. Legions march, armies invade, flags change. Sometimes power works differently. Sometimes the strongest force is a system so useful that even its enemies end up adopting it. Consider something familiar. Much of the modern world uses concepts that originated elsewhere. Parliamentary structures, Roman legal traditions, Arabic numerals, Western accounting standards. Countries didn't necessarily adopt them because they admired the cultures that created them. They adopted them because they worked. China's bureaucratic tradition operated in a similar way for centuries. And here's where many discussions stop too early. People often say China assimilated its conquerors, as if this were some mysterious cultural superpower. But that explanation leaves out an uncomfortable question. Why didn't the same thing happen everywhere? After all, many civilizations had rich cultures. Many had advanced traditions. Many were conquered. Yet few repeatedly transformed conquerors into defenders of the existing order. The answer may have less to do with philosophy and more to do with scale. Remember the phrase gravitational pull from part 1. Let's return to it. A small civilization can be replaced. A medium-sized civilization can be reshaped. But once a society becomes large enough, dense enough, and institutionally sophisticated enough, it starts exerting pressure on whoever governs it. The ruler begins adapting to the system faster than the system adapts to the ruler. That's the pattern we're tracking. And nowhere is it clearer than in a small decision that sounds unbelievably boring at first: the civil service examination. I warned you, the boring parts matter. For centuries, aspiring officials studied Confucian classics, memorized texts, wrote essays, and competed for government positions through an examination system that became one of the most sophisticated recruitment mechanisms in the pre-modern world. People often focus on the exams as an educational institution. I think that's missing the bigger point. The exams were a machine for manufacturing a governing class. A machine so effective that even foreign dynasties eventually found themselves relying on it. Because once you need millions of taxpayers, thousands of local administrators, grain transport networks, legal records, census data, and provincial governance to function at the same time, ideology starts losing arguments to practicality. And that leads us to the deeper question. What if the conquerors weren't really surrendering to Chinese culture at all? What if they were surrendering to something even more powerful? A civilization-sized operating system that made ruling China possible in the first place. And once we look at it that way, the pattern doesn't stop with the Mongols and the Manchus. It starts appearing in places most people never think to look. There's a temptation to treat this story as evidence of some unique cultural force. A civilization so confident, so sophisticated, so attractive that everyone eventually became Chinese. I think that's only half true, and the missing half is more interesting. Because if culture alone explains the pattern, then we have a problem. The Mongols conquered much of Eurasia. They ruled over Persians, Russians, Central Asians, and Chinese populations. Yet the outcomes weren't identical. Different Mongol successor states evolved in different directions. Some became Persianized, others integrated into Islamic traditions, some fragmented entirely. The conquerors didn't always transform the same way. They transformed according to the civilization they needed to govern. That changes the story. Suddenly, we're not talking about the irresistible appeal of Chinese poetry or Confucian ethics, important as those were. We're talking about something more structural, the relationship between scale and governance. Take Beijing itself. When foreign rulers entered the city, they weren't merely occupying a capital. They were plugging themselves into the command center of one of the most complex political systems on Earth. Imagine sitting down at the controls of a machine built over centuries. You can refuse to use the controls. You can insist on doing things your own way. But eventually you'll discover the machine was designed to keep running with or without your preferences. And if you want it to keep feeding cities, collecting taxes, maintaining roads, preventing famine, and suppressing rebellions, you'll probably start using the controls as intended. That isn't surrender, it's adaptation. Yet adaptation has consequences. This is where the story reverses. Because throughout this video, we've been discussing how conquerors changed after taking Beijing. The assumption hidden underneath is that China remained fundamentally unchanged. That isn't actually true. The conquerors were transformed by China. China was also transformed by the conquerors. The Qing dynasty is the clearest example. Modern China's borders owe an enormous amount to Manchu expansion. Territories such as Tibet, Xinjiang, Mongolia, and large portions of the western frontier became integrated into the Qing imperial framework under Manchu rule. In other words, the dynasty that supposedly became Chinese permanently altered what China itself would become. That's the twist. The process wasn't absorption, it was fusion. The conquerors entered the system, but they also rewrote parts of it. A modern Chinese citizen looking at a map of China is partly looking at the legacy of rulers who originally came from beyond the Great Wall. History rarely gives us clean winners and losers. It gives us hybrids. The same thing happened culturally. The queue hairstyle worn during the Qing period came from Manchu tradition. Military institutions changed. Court rituals changed. Elite politics changed. Even concepts of imperial identity evolved. China influenced the conquerors. The conquerors influenced China. Both emerged different. And yet one side changed more than the other. Why? Numbers matter. Population matters. Institutional depth matters. A ruling elite of a few 100,000 people can dominate tens of millions militarily. Changing the underlying civilization is much harder. The Qing understood this better than anyone. At their peak, the Manchus actively worked to preserve their distinct identity. They maintained banner systems. They protected separate cultural traditions. They restricted intermarriage in various periods. They knew exactly what they were fighting against. Demographics. A few million people ruling hundreds of millions. History has a sense of humor sometimes. The most successful conquerors of China spent centuries trying to avoid becoming fully Chinese, while simultaneously governing through Chinese institutions. Those goals gradually collided, and eventually the institutions won more often than the resistance did. There's another reason this pattern keeps appearing, a practical one. Every ambitious ruler wants legitimacy. Force gets obedience. Legitimacy gets cooperation. They're not the same thing. A village can obey because soldiers are nearby. A civilization cooperates because it believes the ruler has a right to govern. The mandate of heaven wasn't merely a philosophical concept. It was a political technology. Once foreign rulers claimed the mandate, performed imperial rituals, upheld Confucian governance, sponsored examinations, and positioned themselves as defenders of order, they gained access to something armies couldn't provide: acceptance. Not universal acceptance, not immediate acceptance, but enough. And here's a question I find fascinating. At what point does a foreign dynasty stop being foreign? 1 generation? 3 generations? 10? The grandson of a conqueror often sees the world differently than the conqueror himself. The great-grandson even more so. By the time several generations have grown up inside Chinese institutions, read Chinese texts, governed Chinese provinces, and thought of Beijing as home, what exactly remains foreign? That's not an easy question to answer, which is why the pattern survived for so long. The military conquest happened quickly. The cultural negotiation lasted centuries, and if we follow that logic all the way to the present day, it leads to a conclusion that has surprisingly little to do with ancient history and quite a lot to do with modern power. The reason this story matters isn't because it tells us something about medieval horse archers. It's because it tells us something about power, and power is often misunderstood. We tend to imagine it in visible forms: armies, weapons, territory, GDP, fleets, missiles. Those things matter. Sometimes they matter enormously. The Mongols would not have reached Beijing through superior poetry. The Manchus did not cross the Great Wall armed with administrative theory. Military force opened the door. What happened afterward is the lesson, because there are really 2 kinds of power: the power to take control and the power to define what control looks like. Those are not always held by the same actor. A conqueror can seize the palace. Yet if the tax system, legal system, bureaucracy, education system, and political legitimacy all operate according to rules created long before his arrival, he enters the game as a winner while still playing on someone else's board. That's what happened repeatedly in China. And I suspect that's why the pattern fascinates people hundreds of years later. It feels counterintuitive. The victorious army arrives expecting to reshape the civilization. Instead, the civilization gradually reshapes the rulers. Not completely, not instantly, but enough to matter. Remember the question from earlier: at what point does a foreign dynasty stop being foreign? History never provides a precise answer. Yet by the late Qing period, many Manchu rulers were defending a Chinese imperial order that their ancestors had once conquered. They sponsored Confucian scholarship, presided over Chinese institutions, governed through Chinese political concepts. Their legitimacy rested largely on their ability to perform the role of Chinese emperors successfully. The transformation wasn't absolute, but it was real. And that brings us to my opinion. I don't think Chinese culture was uniquely irresistible. I think that's too simple. What made China different was the combination of scale, continuity, and institutional sophistication. Those three forces reinforced one another for centuries. A large population created administrative demands. Administrative demands strengthened institutions. Strong institutions created continuity. Continuity made adaptation more rewarding than replacement. Eventually, even conquerors found it easier to work with the system than against it. The culture mattered. The bureaucracy mattered. The legitimacy framework mattered. Together, they created something remarkably durable, a civilization capable of surviving dynastic collapse, invasion, civil war, fragmentation, and foreign conquest without losing its core political identity. That's much rarer than people realize. Many great civilizations disappeared. Others fragmented into entirely new political forms. China repeatedly bent without breaking. There's also a doubt that deserves acknowledgement. Were the conquerors truly assimilated, or are historians overstating the process? It's a fair question. The Manchus preserved elements of their identity for centuries. Mongol influence never vanished entirely. Foreign dynasties left lasting marks on the society they governed. The reality is probably messier than either side admits. Neither complete absorption nor complete separation, something in between. A long negotiation where both parties changed, but one civilization had far more leverage than the other simply because it represented hundreds of millions of people and centuries of accumulated institutions. History usually rewards nuance. This case is no exception. Which brings me to a prediction. As the 21st century unfolds, I think we'll hear less about military conquest and more about institutional gravity. Countries, companies, and political systems increasingly compete not just to become powerful, but to become indispensable. To build standards, networks, technologies, financial systems, and administrative frameworks that others eventually adopt because operating outside them becomes too costly. That's a very old form of influence. China understood it centuries ago, even if nobody called it that. The Mongols entered Beijing believing they had conquered China. The Manchus entered Beijing believing they could rule China without becoming part of it. Both discovered the same thing. Taking the capital was the easy part. Learning how to govern what they had taken was where the real story began. And perhaps that's the broader lesson. Civilizations are not measured by whether they avoid conquest. They're measured by what survives after the conquerors arrive. If you enjoyed this one, stick around for the next deep dive. There are a few more historical patterns hiding in plain sight that become much stranger the closer you look. The armies rode into Beijing as victors. History remembers many of them as Chinese dynasties.